Jean-Marc, and also Siobhan for convening this amazing panel, and for GCSP for inviting me back to share my latest, more importantly, the focus on how the pandemic is actually impacting global illicit networks. So I'm going to be sharing a presentation with you that will actually add to what we're looking at. There we go. And more importantly, we've actually touched upon several of the aspects of the kind of multidimensional impact that COVID-19 has had. No country has been immune, but sadly we're seeing Latin America and the Caribbean really bearing the brunt right now as the new epicenter for COVID-19. So we've actually already addressed the public health, the economic prosperity issues, and the lack of growth. And more importantly, what we're looking at is what's going to happen next. I'm going to speak a little bit to what has been happening with the security forces, both military and police, in response to the pandemic on top of their traditional national security roles. And then more importantly, this question about democracy. Have the lockdowns create this pent-up reaction? And more importantly, how is it going to evolve when we start to have the lifting of all of these quarantines and lockdowns? We've actually seen, sadly, in the United States, due to the really terrible experience in Minneapolis, how people have literally escaped from quarantine and have totally disregarded any social distancing in the protests that we've seen in the last 2 weeks. But what we're taking a look at in this part of the panel is the globalization of illicit networks. We're going to focus on Latin America, but more importantly, how Latin America has contributed to global illicit trafficking, whether it's through drugs, human trafficking, arms, gold, and other illicit activities, but more importantly, how it's being impacted. And Elisa had already spoken about the global value chain and the global supply chains bearing the brunt of the response to COVID-19, which have been tremendous lockdowns and actual paralysis of global trade and then physical movement. So as you know, these illicit activities, whether it's drug trafficking, human trafficking, contraband, and corruption and financial crimes are actually not new. What's happened over the last 3 years is because of the factors of globalization, we've seen these activities multiply so that the magnitude, the velocity, the wealth, and unfortunately, in the case of Latin America and the Caribbean, the violence accompanying this illicit activities have been directly challenging the 4 basic missions of the nation state, which are to provide security, promote prosperity, establish some sense of society or rule of law, and then more importantly, this issue of governance. So what's happening now is that each of these different illicit activities is directly affected by the pandemic and the political decisions in order to respond to COVID-19. The most impacted has been the actual stop in global trade and travel in the Americas. And we've seen actually the huge impact that's going to have, as Elisa mentioned, it's going to be about 19% contraction in global remittances to the region, and tremendous contraction in terms of tourism and the commodities market that directly affect every one of the 33 countries in the region. What we're seeing too, because of the closed borders, there's actually no movement, or very little movement in terms of migration, both legal as well as illegal. And what's happening now is that those who started as victims of human smuggling, where they pay for a fee to get from point A to point B, in the case of the United States, many Central Americans who are making their way to the United States, has actually stopped and trickled because there's actually no work in the United States. So you're actually having something which we did not anticipate, which is a reverse. You actually have Central Americans who, when the economy contracted so dramatically in the United States, particularly in either landscaping or more importantly, the support, the industries such as restaurants, they've actually tried to make their way back. So you actually have Guatemalans leaving the United States, going through Mexico, and being tested at the border of their home country for COVID-19, because they'd rather spend time and more importantly, quarantine with their families. What we're worried about now is as we have the easing of the restrictions on the economy And the United States is quite poised well to recover quicker than the Latin American countries. We're expecting later on the year and next year a renewal of those waves of migration towards the United States from the South. By the way, it's not just Central Americans or Latin Americans. They're actually those who are also still trapped in this supply chain who come from different parts of the world. They're called extracontinentales, not from the continents. What we're seeing though, sadly, because there's no movement, it's also impeded a lot of law enforcement's ability to rescue victims of human traffickers. And we're very worried that those who are in this supply chain of human trafficking are going to be victimized. As Monica had mentioned, we don't know what's happening to them because they're basically incarcerated wherever their traffickers are holding them until there's a better time for them to move out. The other piece that's been very impacted is the movement of the Venezuelans. As you know, Venezuela is the largest humanitarian and refugee crisis that Latin America has experienced in history. And we've had, prior to the pandemic, over 5 million Venezuelans who had left. Several of them have been trying to go back as well. And as we had heard with Alvaro's presentation, Venezuela is like a black box. No one really knows what the statistics are of the number of people who've been infected or died of COVID. And it already had been experiencing a massive humanitarian, economic, and political crisis that's now just been compounded by the case of COVID-19. So what's been in the news a lot has been the impact on global drug trafficking because of COVID-19's lockdown and physical interruption of the supply chains. Elise had mentioned global value chains. This is the problem that a lot of the drug traffickers are having, the inability to access, in the case of processing cocaine, heroin, opioids, fentanyl, and methamphetamine, the precursor chemicals from China because of the paralysis of global trade. The other piece is to actually get the drugs to market. The closure of the US-Mexico border and US-Canada border has really impeded. What's so interesting is the Mexican drug cartels are actually now hoarding drugs because of this fear that they're not going to have supply chain for the future. What's interesting in terms of global consumption of drugs, we've actually seen a dramatic decrease of recreational use of these types of drugs. But unfortunately, here in the United States, we've seen many more cases of overdoses for those who are truly addicted as a health problem. And this is something that we're going to anticipate as well. There'll be actually more people because of the economic and the social stress they're experiencing through lockdown. We're anticipating much more substance abuse, not just drugs, but alcohol, and also, sadly, abuse in the home, which is what Monica's intervention had to do with. We expect this to actually restart as global trade, but they're changing in terms of what they're going to be focusing on. And that's the piece that Antonio referred to, how adaptable and resilient these criminal organizations are. And they're very agile in identifying new markets and new opportunities. The other piece, which I spent a lot of time at, is looking at how the money is moving. Because of the physical restrictions in terms of borders and travel, it's very difficult to execute trade-based money laundering because you just don't have the volume of goods and products moving that you can over and under invoice. The physical movement of bulk cash. We've actually had record seizures of cash in the United States because the drug traffickers can't physically move, they're hoarding it. And also because there's so much ability to see suspicious transactions or suspicious activities, you can actually identify why are those people out on the street after curfew. They're actually raising their profile of risk compared to in a normal functioning economy. And we've seen an explosion of activity on the internet and the use of cryptocurrencies, particularly during the pandemic. So what's happening now is we're actually observing how these criminal organizations are adapting in the age of COVID. You're moving from more global to local. We've actually seen, sadly, in the case of Mexico, still record numbers of homicide and violence, despite the lockdowns, where they're actually, the little cartelitos are vying for control of their local areas of operation. And also a new opportunity to actually start trafficking in medical supplies, these fake remedies. I think it's 6 out of 10 pharmaceuticals that are being moved all around the world are deemed to be either they're illegally made or illicitly diverted from a regular source. So this is what they're doing. It's a different type of trading in illicit activities, whether it's masks or PPE or different pieces. And because of the economic constraints, with people having less disposable income, we're seeing and anticipating more flow of counterfeit goods. As I mentioned earlier, as we've seen the increase of use of cryptocurrency, cybercrime and fraud has just exploded. And this is an area that every country and jurisdiction is grappling with to actually anticipate how do you detect, and then more importantly, how do you go after crimes in cyberspace that are very hard to follow, not just the money, but the people and the origin of where these cyber schemes are taking place. As was mentioned earlier in Antonio's, you're actually seeing more extortion, more kidnapping, very similar to moving from global to local crime. And sadly, it's actually been documented quite extensively in the Italian mafias, the 'Ndrangheta, are actually issuing loan sharks and very high interest loans, which are happening also in Latin America because small and medium business owners can't access the capital they need to maintain their normal activity, and they will be indebted forever to these groups. And what's illustrated with the case of Rio de Janeiro, this idea of providing social services in the place of government is happening not just in Brazil, but throughout Central America and in Mexico. So what's happening right now, and it's been happening even before the pandemic, we were seeing a shift of transnational organized crime capitalizing on cyberspace. And the dark net, you can actually order, in the United States, you can order your fentanyl from the luxury of your house and couch and have it delivered to your post office box. And we're seeing much more fluidity and comfort of these criminals in dealing with cryptocurrencies, and then more importantly, contact each other through the dark net and the dark web. So as I mentioned before, and I think it was so well outlined by the Fukuyama quote about state capacity. Here on your left, you can see in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel with boxes, they're called care packages that have food and medicine and hand sanitizer, and they're actually branded with the face of El Chapo Guzman. And then on the right is an example of the favelas, of how they were taking things into their own hands to basically raise the awareness for those who are less educated and don't have the same access about the importance of washing your hands. And this is this idea of actually taking the role of the traditional government and creating this idea of alternative governance. So what do we need to do when we're thinking of transnational organized crime? And more importantly, how these groups are adapting in the age of COVID-19. First, we have to think about expanding the role of military and security services within the law to support civilian authorities. They had their traditional roles. In certain countries, they are engaged in border security, natural disaster response, but even more so on countering transnational organized crime. On top of that, now they have even more requirements in terms of physically assisting in the COVID response. In the case of Mexico, for example, many of the Mexican uniformed services are also converting all of their hospitals to address the needs, as well as secure the supply chains for PPE. But it might be at the expense of their traditional security roles. As we enter an era of much stricter budgets and much more tightening budgets, this is a huge risk that could also end up empowering these criminal organizations. Second, we have to understand and monitor and study the way these groups are changing their behavior, whether it's anticipating it, and then more importantly, being able to resource the response in an adequate and a timely fashion. And this is particularly challenging in the cyber domain. Then the third piece is we really need to reinforce the presence of the state in these marginalized communities at risk. And I think Antonio's explanation of what's happening in Rio is just a great case study in what could happen. And then more importantly, we need to promote an interagency and international response because now national security has always included health security, but it's even more so front and center that we're seeing right now. And you actually take a look at the response to COVID in different aspects. And it's actually, if we think about it scientifically, in how to detect the disease, how to develop therapeutics, and then the third piece now, which is the race for the vaccine. We've actually seen in the health sector great collaboration between the public sector, the private sector, and the civic sector. So what I propose is that we actually have to think of this whole of nation approach, not just in the health response to the pandemic, but in the national security response, trying to mitigate how these transnational criminal organizations might capitalize on this new landscape of greater inequality, greater corruption, and new markets, and figure out how to nip them in the bud, working within our countries, but also cross-border, sharing best practices and lessons learned. And that's what I wanted to share today. Thank you.